Thanks for inviting me to do this. I thought rather than just kind of talk about the findings and all of that, I might say a little bit about the whole kind of research process, and just as a kind of maybe is a bit more kind of interesting than just for those of you who are not as interested in Turkey as I am, which probably all of you. Um, so this is part of a much bigger project that I'm involved in, looking at the way that the public sector in Turkey has managed what are unprecedented influx of refugees. No one knows how many Syrians live in Turkey today. Many of them are counted twice as they move from city to city. Many of them are not counted at all. So estimates are really contested, but there's probably at least 3 million Syrians living now in Turkey, and which is an extraordinary number if you think that the David Cameron government reluctantly agreed to take 20,000 and then didn't. So virtually every city in Turkey now has a substantial Syrian minority living in it, and of course many of these people are never going home. So Turkey has changed forever. The refugee population as well is believed to be extremely young, and predominantly women of childbearing age. So we can expect that number to grow exponentially over the next generation. So Turkey has fundamentally changed forever, I think. And there's really very little acknowledgement of that. There's still this kind of notion of temporary protection given to Syrians. So this was a piece of work that we undertook in 2017 at the beginning of this project, when we got initially some pilot funding from the university, and then a small grant from the British Academy. And I was working with a colleague in HCRI who's now at Durham, Roger, and an old friend of mine from Turkey called Bülent, who teaches divinity, ilahiyat is divinity, and has taught divinity in Uludağ University, which is in Bursa, in one of the larger cities in Turkey, and has taught that for many years. And in teaching religious studies, he's trained a lot of imams who get sent there to complete their studies. Being an imam in Turkey is now a degree entry profession, and so that's given him huge contacts throughout the country within the Department of Religious Affairs, which is an enormous entity in Turkey, 120,000 employees, bigger than the Ministry of Interior. So really Roger and I were using Bülent's kind of gatekeeper status, his extraordinary network of contacts throughout the country, to access a group of people who really haven't been studied at all. I mean, my literature review that I did for this paper threw up, I think, 3 or 4 English language papers on the Vaiz. That's it, nothing other than that. Even though there's 4,000 Vaiz working in Turkey, and have played a crucial role in helping Syrian refugees, or representing the Turkish state, actually, in the management of Syrian refugees. That project's now kind of finished, and we've done that, but now we've moved on to working with the Department of the Directorate General of Migration Management, DGMM, in Turkey. And so we've just completed a kind of 3-year research bid for that, put into the ESRC last month. And so we're going to sort of extend this work and look at another big sector, a big area of the public sector in Turkey, how they're working with Syrian refugees. We're particularly interested in kind of conflict management and that kind of thing, but I'll come on to that as we go through. So our starting point really is that, I think, as Dilek has just sort of alluded to, religious studies is a kind of forgotten area of academic research in much of the liberal arts universities around the world. There's an implicit or sometimes explicit distinction between knowledge and understanding derived from religious texts and that derived from the secular Western tradition. And we wanted to kind of, discomfort that in some way and challenge that kind of those kind of assumptions. And you can see sort of evidence of that, rather artificial divide everywhere. I mean, for example, if you look at a 2014 special edition of Forced Migration Review, which is 84 pages long, and has the title Faith and Responses to Displacement. In 84 pages, it mentions the word God only 4 times. So even when religious kind of faith narratives appear in the academic literature, they're very much kind of de-religiousized, de-sacralized, something like that. The actual content of Christian, Jewish, etc. teaching is taken out, and faith is seen as an ideological result of other forces, social forces, economic, political, and so on. Whereas that's not really very useful in approaching Turkey, where the religion plays a huge part in not just individual people's lives, but actually in the public sector as well, in the way that people are governed. So we're interested in the way that Islamic values specifically informed the public sector response to the Syrian problem. And there's not much literature on public sector responses in general. Most of the literature is on NGOs, or is on micro studies of individual agency, i.e. looking at the refugees themselves and coping strategies and so on. So we wanted to, on the one hand, look at public officials, civil servants, and on the other hand, faith, actually the meaningful content of faith. And so just a bit of background quickly. I mean, most Syrians in Turkey are believed to live in the southeast of the country, near the Syrian border. Outside of that, the big centers are Istanbul, Ankara, Konya, and Bursa, where we did this study. So if I don't, so I now try and move this slide down. Yes, here's a bit some imagery. So you can see Bursa with the pin there. It's in Turkey, the most affluent area of Turkey. It's a massive industrial city, probably 2.5 million, and it's built around a huge mountain called Uludağ. That's the name of the university, Uludağ University. And so we worked with 2 key individuals within the Muftiyet, the religious affairs department within the city. So the Mufti himself, who runs manages religious affairs within the city on behalf of the state, and that's the guy on the bottom right, Mehmet I at the time. He was a professor of religious studies, and he was appointed to lead the department. And the vice mufti, which in Turkey is typically female, and that's Sedinur Hanım, who is on next to him there. So these 2 individuals are absolutely crucial to our study. They have a lot of authority. I think Mehmet was telling me he had 75,000 Facebook followers, something like that. So he's a big name locally, and he works in this office on the bottom left here, which is where we did most of our research. And this is the Muftiyet, the center of religious management. So essentially, they manage mosques, they manage public events, they go into schools and do teaching on religion and so on. Okay, so and within the big organization that Sedinur and Mehmet run there are the Vaiz. So the Vaiz are essentially translated as preachers, although they're not really preachers at all. They do give talks, certainly not preachers in any kind of what you might think of Christian tradition. They do give talks of various kinds all over the place, in mosques and outside. They do lots of educational events, especially for kids, cultural activities, and so on. They also run fatwa services. So they were led by the Mufti, who is the legal authority. in the city. They issue fatwas, which are legal opinions. And so they're very busy with that. They have a kind of fatwa hotline, which they manage, call center, people phoning up and asking for Islamic guidance, ethical problems, legal problems. I haven't seen my husband for many years. How do I go about arranging a divorce, for example? That's something that they would deal with. So they kind of work in parallel with the temporal secular authorities in Turkey. And they work with families, individuals and organizations and so on. And so they're the kind of linchpin between local mosque activities and religious affairs of ordinary Muslims in Turkey and the state. And so, of course, what happens is Syrians arrive in Bursa, which is a traditional route from Haleb, from Aleppo to Bursa, big old trading links between the two cities. So most of the refugees come from Aleppo. They arrive in Bursa and they end up sleeping in a mosque. So, you know, especially if they come in winter, weather's bad, they go to mosques, which are always open, warm, dry, and they end up kind of sleeping in there or begging in there. Not all of them, of course. They're an immensely diverse bunch. Some are very wealthy, some are got great, you know, bring businesses, etc., etc., etc. But many are not. Many are struggling, and they end up in mosques, and there they come across the Vaiz. So the Imam doesn't know what to do, so he phones the Vaiz, and the Vaiz come, and we're interested. This project was interested in what happens next, really. How do the Vaiz? What role do the Vaiz play in managing these refugees in different ways? Working with the local community and with the refugees themselves. Okay, so just then there's a couple of, well, I'll just go through some findings, I suppose, of what we found here. But just by a bit of background, there's a couple of kind of interesting things that we found, the way that the Vaiz sort of initially responded. There's kind of a few things in the paper that pointed out there. I'll just point to one. And one is the use of language, which we found very interesting. So Turkish is a modern language, largely invented in the 1920s by this kind of very authoritarian interwar government, rather typical of European governments at the time in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of the old language was swept away and replaced with neologisms and, you know, modernized. But it's interesting, and there's two words that are in current usage in Turkey for refugee. One, the contemporary word is multije, but the older word is muhajir, which is of Arabic origin. And we found that the Vaiz continually use the word muhajir, and that we found quite interesting. The word muhajir has got lots of connotations. It comes from hajj, so it connects the refugee with pilgrimage and the notion of movement. The Prophet himself, of course, was a refugee. He ran away from repression in Mecca and lived in another city in Medina for quite a lot of his adult life. And so the word muhajir connects the refugees to his own life, to the Prophet's own life in some way. But the word muhajir also relates to emigres from Europe during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And this is a key fundamental element of the way that Turkish officials, or certainly the Vaiz, see the refugees. Turkey regards itself as the post-colonial state in the Middle East. It is by far the biggest economy in the Middle East still today. And Syria was part of Turkey, right? It's part of the Ottoman Empire. So muhajir conjures up ideas of refugees moving from one part of the Ottoman Empire to another. And that's quite interesting, how this kind of paternalistic element to how Turkish people view Syrians as a sense of kind of post-colonial responsibility. And then the final thing, multiji really is about crossing borders, whereas muhajir may have moved within Muslim lands through choice. So there's an element of choice in muhajir, and that kind of, we thought, implied greater agency to the Syrian refugees, that they're making an informed choice. They're not as kind of desperate and poverty stricken as sometimes assumed more generally. Okay, so we can sort of look at some findings now. There's sort of three areas that we organized the findings into. The Vaiz are having to deal with kind of very typical problems of integration versus multiculturalism. How do you integrate this large Syrian minority in some way without kind of losing something, without assimilating, I suppose. All these terms are very contested, I know. But there was also a sense that they wanted to maintain some kind of Syrian identity. And this, of course, in Turkey is an immensely hot topic because of the sustained Kurdish campaign for very similar language rights. So if the Syrians are going to be given Arabic schools, well, where are the Kumanji speaking schools? Where are the Zaza speaking schools for the Kurds? And so this is a very kind of delicate issue that the Vaiz are trying to manage here. They're promoting Turkish language because, especially the older refugees desperately need that. All the little kids now that are running about in the street, little Syrian kids, are indistinguishable from Turkish kids now. They all speak perfect Turkish. But for the older ones, it's a real challenge. But at the same time, the Vaiz wanted to maintain Arabic language, Arabic identity. And this really kind of, all kind of came to like a pivot point really in schooling. So you have tens of thousands of teenage kids, sort of let's say 12 to 18, who are unlikely to be able to pick up Turkish very quickly, certainly not as quickly as the sort of 3 to 10-year-olds. And so they need schooling. It's a whole lost generation of Syrian children without getting any education. But what school do you put them in? You can't just drop them straight into a Turkish school. They don't understand anything. They'll fail their exams, etc. And the outcomes are then all quite poor. So the Syrians themselves set up local schools. And one is here in the picture. Rizalet was one of the bigger Turkish schools that Syrian schools that we visited. But these are very controversial because there's quite a strong sense of indivisible nationhood in Turkey, and having the idea of separate schools, much like here, I suppose, in the UK, is contentious and can be seen as a division. And of course, overlaid onto that, and we're coming a bit more onto managing local conflicts now, is the whole bloodbath of northern Syria. The refugees themselves are not isolated from that. They brought with them all the dynamics of the conflict. So you had large numbers of refugees that have served in Assad's regime. Of course, it's a conscription army. They had no choice. They were brought into the army. And of course, on one side, and on the other side, of course, you've got Syrian refugees from the Free Syrian Army, from Jabhat al-Nusra. No one ever says that they're from Daesh, of course. That was never, of all the Syrian refugees we met, no one said, oh yeah, I was served in Islamic State. No. But of course they did. And so all of that is brought with them. And on top of that, of course, they're living in the poorer parts of the Turkish cities, which are themselves home to large Kurdish minorities, many of whom suffered great losses at the hands of Syrian forces in Kobani and in other battles around this time. So the Vaiz are trying to manage what essentially is being fought out on Turkish streets, battles within the Syrian refugee community. Alongside that, of course, they've got real problems in managing the Turkish majority. They have seen their public services overwhelmed. There's a very big backlash across Turkey that the Vaiz are trying to manage. And so they're emphasizing things like Islamic tolerance, traditions of welcome and hospitality, and the need to support refugees, and they're constantly kind of referring to Islamic jurisprudence and so on. And we looked at all that, and we describe quite a bit of that in the paper. And we're kind of interested there, I suppose, in the actual faith content of that. And then sort of finally, we looked then at the provision of social services. I mean, all these things overlap, of course. And particularly here, we looked at health and education, and also trying to get people into work. And the Vaiz played quite a big role in tackling precarious unemployment, actually. And this was a big, at the time we were interviewing them, quite a big preoccupation of those of them, that the Syrians were predominantly doing 3D type jobs: dirty, difficult, and dangerous. And this opened up quite a big further debate within the Muftiate about, the Islamic kind of how Islamic, I suppose, it is to employ people in these circumstances, and more Islamic forms of employment where people are paid a better wage, they're given greater security. And this was all linked then to ideas of Islamic justice and social protection. Okay, so I'll probably sort of just leave it there, and maybe we can talk a bit about the paper as a whole, because I think you have it in front of you there. Okay, thanks.